Basically, what we've got coming up today is I've actually had a chance to sit down and actually try and find some more source content. Two reasons really. Firstly, I'm getting a bit short, so more was obviously required, and I'm just happy with the way things are going at the minute. So I've really, it's the time. Time is important, you know. Other things might be more important, looking for content, but I've had a chance now to get to where I want to be, so I've got a chance to really look for some proper content. And with that in mind, I found an interesting show yesterday, without a doubt, from our friends, the Council on Foreign Relations. They do a podcast. Well, why shouldn't they? I can do one, they can do one. That's fair enough, isn't it? They can scrutinise mine, I can scrutinise theirs as well, obviously, if they want to. I found it baffling. It's called the President's Inbox, which kind of says it all, doesn't it? Really, instructions to the presidents of America. This one is about the authorised use of military force. But before that, I just want to play a little clip. It's from the great William Cooper, yet again. Thank you very much to Doyle from the Hour of the Time for allowing us to play Bill's content. This is just a short clip. I think it adds some essential context into what I'm about to play you.
The largest intelligence apparatus in the world, with the biggest budget in the history of the world, has been looking for Osama bin Laden for years and years and years, and can't find him. Some doofus jerk-off reporter with a camera crew waltzes right into his hideout and interviews him. So why do all these fools believe this charade? That a CNN reporter and his little camera crew can do what all the money and all the assets and all the eavesdropping and all the intelligence and all the satellites and all the undercover operatives in the world can never do. It's because they're not trying, they don't want to. Osama bin Laden is their creation, and he is serving them well. I mean, is this some kind of incredible joke that people are so stupid they'll fall for this? And now we're being bombarded with messages that Osama bin Laden is planning to attack the United States of America and Israel. Let me tell you something. If he's an enemy of Israel and the Mossad can't find him, then this thing is the biggest joke that you ever heard of in your life. And I'm telling you, be prepared for a major attack. But it won't be Osama bin Laden. It will be those behind the New World Order who once again want to take the guns and the freedom away from the American people, because we're the only ones left in the world who can oppose the destruction of freedom in the world and then the implementation of a one-world totalitarian socialist government, and that is the goal. And whatever is going to happen that they're going to blame on Osama bin Laden, don't you even believe it. Another social illusion, social engineering project to change the minds and the attitudes and the beliefs of the people of the world, and especially the United States, to bring about one world socialist totalitarian government. I wonder what Osama bin Laden's targets are supposed to be. And if they don't, if this doesn't materialize in the next 2 or 3 weeks, it will eventually materialize, because they haven't succeeded in getting the guns out of the hands of the American people, nor have they succeeded in taking our freedoms away. In fact, there's been a great awakening in this country and a big backlash against these Marxist, communist, puke-faced, lying, subversive, Nazi, jackbooted Gestapo thugs that is gaining momentum. And so I can tell you with a certainty, they must do something terrible in order to stop this backlash and regain the sympathy of the mass herds of sheeple out there. And supposedly we're not the only nation searching for Osama bin Laden. So the vast economic resources, the vast technological resources, the vast personnel resources, the vast networks and intricate web spun over all these years by the CIA, the FBI, and the NSA can't find Osama bin Laden, but CNN can? Bullshit. What a crying shame. How in the world could this country of all nations breed such a dumbed down, unthinking, illiterate, uneducated, stupid, ignorant population?
Incredible piece of audio there, I'm sure. So with that in mind, this just over 46 minutes audio. Wow. We like people to draw our own conclusions, as you know. So with that in mind, obviously you've heard the last clip. So now I'm going to play out the Council on Foreign Relations. This episode is actually from November the 9th of this month. So it's a few weeks old. But I think it's still in a very, very interesting conversation. The three guys, they introduce themselves. I'm not going to introduce them. We're not really going to go into the characters presenting the show in great depth at this stage. We're just going to let them speak for themselves, listen to what they say, and then hopefully we'll have more of an idea of what exactly is going on in this world. That's the idea anyway. Enough of me banging on anyway. The next bit of the audio you will hear will be the Council on Foreign Relations podcast from November the 9th of this year, part of the series of the President's Inbox. Thank you for listening, and all the best.
Welcome to the President's Inbox, a CFR podcast about the foreign policy challenges facing President Donald Trump. I'm James Lindsay, Director of Studies at the Council on Foreign Relations.
And I'm Robert McMahon, Managing Editor of CFR.org.
This week we are discussing the authorization for the use of military force, or AUMF, the legal basis for the American War on Terror.
And our expert guide this week is CFR's John Bellinger. John is Adjunct Senior Fellow for International and National Security Law at the Council. He's also a partner at Arnold & Porter, LLP in Washington, D.C., where he advises sovereign governments and companies on a variety of international law and U.S. national security law issues. From 2005 to 2009, John was the legal advisor for the U.S. State Department under Secretary of State Condoleezza Rice. John also served from 2001 to 2005 as Senior Associate Counsel to the President and legal advisor to the National Security Council at the White House. John, thanks for being here.
Good to be with you all.
Well, John, let's jump right in. You had a close background in drafting the AUMF, the original AUMF, after the 9/11 attacks. In your view, what does it authorize?
So I was the legal advisor to the National Security Council at the time that it was drafted. I was in the Situation Room on 9/11, and it was all hands on deck, both legally and in terms of military intelligence, law enforcement. And one of the things that the lawyers did was to draft both domestic legal authorities and legal authorities for intelligence and law enforcement operations. The authorization to use military force was drafted very hastily by Congress in conjunction with White House lawyers to give the president legal authority by Congress to pursue military means against those who had attacked us on 9/11. It's a very short law, only about 60 words, and it's very broad in most of its meaning. It authorizes all necessary and appropriate force against the organizations, persons, and nations who committed or were responsible for the 9/11 attacks. It doesn't limit it with respect to country, place, or even type of force. So very broad, but with one limitation: it's tied to the persons, organizations, or nations that committed the 9/11 attacks. And that has been the statutory basis for three presidents over the last 16 years to pursue our conflict with a variety of different terrorist groups.
We should be clear here, there's also another authorization for the use of military force that Congress passed in 2002, which authorized then President George W. Bush to use military force against Iraq, which he did use in March of 2003. And that second AUMF, we'll call it AUMF 2002, is also sometimes referred to in these debates about the president's authority to use force overseas against the Islamic State. So there are two, and we'll try to differentiate between the two in our conversation.
And I imagine that the broad nature of it that you mentioned is because there was nothing like this attack, and obviously, and because of the nature of al-Qaeda, because of the asymmetric threat it posed, it was allowing for the ability to be flexible in responding to that. Is that correct?
That's right. And of course, in the couple of days after the 9/11 attacks, no one even really knew that it was al-Qaeda. Of course, we knew that al-Qaeda was over there, the intelligence community, and people were suspected that it was al-Qaeda, but at that point, we didn't even know. So the 2001 authorization doesn't even mention a specific group. It is all necessary and appropriate force against the nations, organizations, or persons who committed the 9/11 attacks.
And it also authorizes the president to use military force against organizations or persons or against anyone that harbored such organizations.
Precisely, and that primarily at that point was, we thought about Afghanistan and the Taliban.
And that extended, we should note, to international law, in that I was covering the UN Security Council at the time, and there was a lot of attention paid to that particular aspect, that countries' Security Council had passed a binding resolution saying countries could not support these actors or would face the consequences.
Correct. And so certainly the president's lawyers at the time, and continue to this day, to believe that these are the military actions that we use against a variety of different terrorist groups, al-Qaeda associated groups, and ISIS, are actions in self-defense, which is permitted under international law under the UN Charter.
So this was a very expansive grant of authority from Congress to the president. Congress obviously exercising its authority under the Constitution to declare war, and having, which includes lesser things as sort of authorizing military activities.
And broadly supported in Congress. This was not, unlike the 2002 AUMF, which you mentioned, Jim, authorizing use of force against the Iraq War, which was controversial. Almost every member of Congress voted, right, not surprisingly, after 9/11.
This was overwhelming, and
right,
it's an expansive
There was only
grant.
one vote against it, right, in the House.
But now we're at a point where many people say that as expansive as it was, we've moved into a different situation, and we need to have a new authorization for the use of military force to deal with groups like al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula, the Islamic State, Boko Haram, and the like.
And also to deal with technology. Drones, I don't think, were on the horizon when this the initial one was.
So maybe you can sort of, what's the problem that we're trying to solve here? Why is it that we actually need something new, since it hasn't seemed to be that the president's been limited in his ability to act, whether we're talking President Obama or President Trump, and there really hasn't been a clamoring on Capitol Hill to fix it? So why are some people talking about the issue?
So we have a legal problem and a constitutional or governmental problem, both of which have been getting worse over the last 16 years. So the authorization to use military force against those persons, organizations, and nations that committed the 9/11 attacks has been stretched more and more by three successive presidents as we've gotten farther from 9/11.
The Islamic State did not exist in 2001 and was not responsible for the attacks.
And let me get to that in a minute, because that's the ultimate stretch. But in between there were some stretching by first President Bush and then certainly by President Obama, as these new groups that were not al-Qaeda, which we had decided were responsible for the 9/11 attacks, but new groups that didn't exist in 2001 came up. So for the last half of the Bush administration, when I was in, and then all through the Obama administration, lawyers and policy officials had to decide, well, were these new groups associated with al-Qaeda so that they could reasonably say that these were really the groups or associated with the groups or sons of the groups that had committed 9/11 attacks. And lawyers have spent over the last 15, 16 years, a lot of time in the Situation Room debating whether the certain groups really are the same groups and therefore that the congressional authorization applies. And as time has gone by, it has gotten to be harder and harder and harder. It's really been stretched to say that certain groups were the groups that committed the 9/11 attacks. And then the ultimate legal stretch, Jim, as you mentioned, was in 2014 with the rise of ISIS. And the Obama administration wanted to and began to use military force against ISIS in Iraq and Syria. And there really wasn't much policy disapproval in Congress or in amongst the American people in going after ISIS. Everybody agreed they're a bad group. But what was the congressional authorization to do that? The president in the summer of 2014 initially relied only on his constitutional power. The president, of course, has broad constitutional power to use military force, but any president always wants to have congressional authorization as well, because then the American people are behind that. The president in 2014, President Obama, initially only relied on his constitutional power, but then, and we will, I'm sure, talk about this in a minute, as he bumped up against what we refer to as the 60-day clock in the War Powers Resolution that purports to prohibit a president from using military force for more than 60 days unless it has been specifically authorized by Congress, the president then notified Congress that, in fact, his use of force in Syria and Iraq against ISIS had, in fact, been specifically authorized by Congress at that point 13 years ago by the 2001 AUMF. And that came as a surprise to both people in Congress who said, wow, I wasn't even here at the time. That authorization that seemed to be against al-Qaeda and the people responsible for 9/11 is now the authorization to use force against ISIS. And amongst national security lawyers, both Republican and Democratic, there was a lot of eye-rolling that this was a real stretch. And particularly because al-Qaeda, this is ironic, had more or less divorced ISIS and said, you are so extreme and different.
You're beyond the pale,
that you are not part of al-Qaeda. So for the president's lawyers to conclude that ISIS really was part of al-Qaeda, even though al-Qaeda said that they weren't, was really the ultimate stretch. And the White House never fully explained their rationale, but they did to a certain extent by saying that they felt that ISIS had descended from or shared the same DNA as al-Qaeda. So this was really the ultimate legal stretch to say that the 2001 authorization passed at that point 13 years previously provided the statutory authorization for the use of force against ISIS.
And is there a practical consequence to stretching it this far?
So that there is. There's legal consequences as to legal challenges, which we can talk about as to, would a detained ISIS, I think it's likely at some point that a detained ISIS person will say, that authorization doesn't cover me, and we can talk about the legal challenges. But what the really bigger problem, which is beginning to seriously trouble members of Congress, particularly people like Tim Kaine and a number of others, is that three successive presidents, and really it's been more just as a matter of time, first president, mostly happening during the Obama administration and now under the Trump administration, is a stretching by the executive of an original authorization by Congress beyond any recognition of what Congress originally voted for. Only about a third of the members of Congress now were in Congress at the time the original authorization was voted. So a number of members of Congress, Tim Kaine again in the lead, but Adam Schiff and others, Jeff Flake, have said this is just not good constitutional government. We do have shared war powers historically under the Constitution between the President and the Congress, and Congress is abdicating its responsibilities both under the Constitution and really just governmentally to vote these war powers. We are letting the president pursue new wars without any new congressional authorization.
So how do you write a new and also effective authorization to use military force? I note that Secretary Tillerson was up on Capitol Hill testifying, and as I read his testimony, he said he wanted three things from any new bill. One, that it be simultaneous, that is, we don't repeal and then wait before we get a new one. Seems reasonable. He doesn't want a time limit because that would send the wrong signal to our adversaries, and he doesn't want a geographical limit. That sounds pretty much like a blank check. And presumably that would just replicate the situation Congress finds itself in right now. General rule of life on Capitol Hill is it's very easy to delegate authority to the White House, very hard to bring it back. How do you square the circle?
So there seem to be two problems in Congress. One is just a problem of political will, and the second is actually agreeing on these details where there are disagreements.
And so just to get at that really quickly, the issue of, say, opposing seeming to oppose an act against a group of bad guys who might then launch some sort of attack against the U.S. and you're standing up there saying, oh, he's the guy who wanted to, block the administration's ability from dealing with it.
Well, really the other way around.
Okay.
Unfortunately, it is really more a question of political cowardice about voting for an authorization. So many members of Congress who either were in at the time now regret their vote on the Iraq 2002 authorization, and people who were not in at the time look back at that and they say, I don't want to be called on to vote for an authorization to use military force, and then if something goes badly or if Americans are killed, which they almost always are, someone is going to blame me, and I will then have to be standing up to my constituents, and they will say, you voted for that authorization to use military force. So in both Republicans and Democrats will tell you this, that they are just, and they will really say this publicly. I've been on panels with both current and former members of Congress who will say it is very hard politically to vote for a new authorization to use military force where we are now sharing the responsibility to send young men and women into battle where they may be killed.
Because the American public is tired of what seems to be the endless war. That's actually something that candidate Trump on the campaign trail went after time and again, saying that we had far too many military interventions. He may have a different view now that he sits in the White House, but I think that was a sentiment that candidate Trump clearly tapped into.
And we saw an aspect of that with the Niger, the reports about what happened in Niger. Special forces ambushed and killed, and what are we doing in Niger?
Correct. And let me get to the legal problems in a minute, but say one more word about this. So we probably have about 24 members of Congress who have been really vocal. And again, I mentioned Tim Kaine again, but only because he's really been the lead on this for a couple of years. And he and a couple of dozen other people have said, look, as hard as it is to vote for an authorization, and these are people who are not war hawks, but they're saying we need to do our jobs in Congress. Otherwise we're just abdicating our responsibility. And as the successive presidents stretch and stretch and stretch this, we can't sit and complain that he's stretching it when we have a role to play here. So he and others have been urging fellow members of Congress to vote on a new authorization. Then, of course, we have, even if you could get 535 members to agree that there ought to be a new authorization to replace the 2001 and 2002 AUMFs, well, what does it say? That's where you get disagreement. And the disagreement is not Republicans on one side and Democrats on the other. There are all sorts of cross currents within each party. The principal issues really come down to about three or so. One, should it be time limited? Because the people have noticed that the 2001 AUMF has been going on for 16 years and seems to be used.
It will go on in perpetuity. There's something that makes it
shut off. So many members, not all, would like to see a sunset. That, Democrats more than Republicans, a sunset of maybe 3 or 5 years. Second would be some limitation on geography so that it's not an authorization to use force anywhere in the world. And then a third would be does it authorize offensive combat operations so that if you
initiating the use of military force somewhere.
And certainly broad ones, in that if you say all necessary and appropriate force, that potentially includes and has included an invasion of and occupation of an entire country. So could you limit that in some way? And that's where successive executive branches, first President Obama and now President Trump, have said, well, we might be willing to work with you on a new authorization, but only if it's not time limited, doesn't limit the president's flexibility, and isn't limited with respect to geography.
And that makes it close to a blank check, which is what you pointed out. Members of Congress are not inclined to give the president for fear that it will entrap us in or lead us to become entrapped in interventions that they don't want to support.
And particularly, as you both have pointed out, as new countries appear to be popping up on the map, and members of Congress are saying really inaccurately that, well, we didn't even know that we were in Niger. Actually, they should have known because the President's War Powers reports.
Well, Lindsey Graham said he
years,
wasn't aware there were 1,000 U.S. troops in Niger.
Right.
And you would expect him to know, given his interest in military issues.
And you would, and I think highly of Senator Graham, but actually the President's War Powers reports for the last couple of years have been listing Niger as a place where U.S. forces are operating.
Let's talk about the broader issue of the President's war powers, because the AUMF is sort of a subset or a specific example of this broader question that's been going on for quite a long time about what the boundaries are of presidential power in using military force. And there are separate questions here. One is an issue of to what extent does the president have constitutional authority on his own to deploy forces abroad, not necessarily initiate military conflict. There's a separate issue of to what extent and under what conditions the president can initiate the use of military force. Can we sort of handle the deployment issue first? Because in the case of Niger, the United States, the president has ordered U.S. troops to go there. They're not there specifically to engage in combat, but to train. But obviously, when you're training people in a situation where there are active combatants on the other side, you run the risk of being engaged in a military firefighting or in combat. So can you sort of walk us through these very complex issues?
Absolutely. And Jim, you're right that any discussion of a authorization to use military force against a particular adversary has to be looked at against the backdrop of the president's overall war powers under the Constitution, and then also this statute that Congress passed in the 1970s during the Vietnam War, the War
over
Powers
Richard Nixon's
Resolution.
veto.
Exactly. So, under the Constitution, the president has, as commander-in-chief and chief executive, very broad war powers. Congress doesn't even dispute that, although there's some disagreement as to precisely how far the president can go. But certainly the president can, as commander-in-chief, deploy forces around the world to train and equip, to certainly to act defensively. The view of the executive branch, and I generally have been an executive branch lawyer, is that the president can even use force, not just deploy the military, to advance a significant national interest. So that doesn't really even mean self-defense. That could be on a peacekeeping mission. It can be to defend another country. It can be to protect people from an act of genocide.
But it's important to note that Congress also on that question has broad constitutional authority to restrict the president from doing that. Though to do so, Congress has to pass a law, which means that at a minimum getting a majority in both houses and usually having to overcome a presidential veto, which means a supermajority. So in some sense, the logistics are a little bit tilted in favor of the president.
Right, right. So the president has broad constitutional authority that even Congress accepts, although there might be some disagreement as to precisely how far the president could go to and how the president determines what is a significant national interest. But then the president's authority is clipped a little bit, and this is where the disagreements have occurred and where more stretching has occurred under this War Powers Resolution from the 1970s that says a couple of things. One, it says that a president may not use force in a foreign country and send forces equipped for combat for more than 60 days unless Congress has specifically authorized it. And it also says that the president has to report within 48 hours of sending forces equipped for combat. The presidents have successively stretched this War Powers Resolution so that because Congress has for the last couple of decades not wanted to pass authorizations for the reasons that we discussed, and that puts the president in a difficult position if he wants to continue a military operation. So let me give you the two controversial examples that really happened during the Obama administration. Is one was actually before ISIS, it was with respect to Libya. So the conflict, the U.S. intervention with the European coalition in Libya was oddly authorized, as Bob knows, by the Security Council under international law, but Congress never gave a specific authorization. So after 60 days of bombing in Libya, President Obama bumped up against this 60-day war clock, which said that he couldn't use force anymore unless Congress had specifically authorized it, and they didn't. So what did he do? Did he stop? No. Did he say the War Powers Resolution was unconstitutional, which some presidents said? No. Instead, he interpreted his way out of it by saying that U.S. forces in Libya were not actually engaged in hostilities, that they were really engaged in sort of support for other military operations. This was largely viewed as laughable, to say that all of these bombing missions were not hostilities. And Congress, after grumping about it for a bit, really didn't do anything about it.
I think it's important to point out that candidate Obama in 2007, 2008, again, a professor of constitutional law part-time, was someone who took a very narrower view of the presidential war-making authorities when he was a candidate, certainly a narrower view than most presidents have taken, at least since the end of World War II.
He said in a questionnaire as a candidate that this is why candidates generally don't make definitive statements, said a president does not have authority to use military force except in self-defense unless authorized by Congress. So in Libya, the President Obama, because he didn't want to stop, interpreted his way out by concluding the War Powers Resolution didn't actually apply because those were not hostilities. Then, as we've discussed, he did it again, and these are not intended to be political comments. These are really just what happened legally. Right. Then ISIS came along a couple of years later, and as we've discussed, he then was faced with another 60-day clock in 2014. Congress again didn't want to vote a new authorization because it was an election year and they wanted to go off and campaign and not vote a new authorization. So President Obama was faced with exactly the same dilemma as with Libya. Was he going to stop using force? No. Was he going to conclude that the War Powers Resolution was unconstitutional as applied to preventing the president with dealing a terrorist threat, which maybe he could have done? No. So what did he do? Well, he did it really again, but instead of saying that the War Powers Resolution didn't apply, because it was a little hard to say that all of this bombing in Iraq and Syria were not hostilities, he said, well, Congress actually had authorized the use of force against ISIS back in this 2001 AUMF. So the big picture here that we're seeing with respect to not only the AUMFs is stretching by successive presidents, but with respect to the War Powers Resolution, which has been something of a straitjacket on successive presidents. So we have seen presidents interpreting their way out of that as well. A few years ago, a really thoughtful commission headed by former Secretaries of State James Baker and Warren Christopher convened a commission on the War Powers Resolution and presidential war powers. This may be 8-9 years ago, and concluded that the War Powers Resolution really was not working as Congress or the president ever intended it to do, and that it ought to be revised and rewritten and probably turned into a consultation requirement. John McCain and Tim Kaine, about 5 years ago, picked up that recommendation and introduced legislation to revise the War Powers Resolution, but that also has not gone anywhere. So the big picture we have at the broadest level, successive presidents stretching these congressional authorizations, working their way around the War Powers statute, and Congress essentially looking the other way and abdicating its responsibilities and sort of mildly grousing on the side.
Let me put in a word for members of Congress here. I think actually their challenge is very difficult. Put aside sort of the political calculations, I understand that. But Congress faces a very difficult issue. It's trying to figure out a way to both empower the president to act, but to constrain the president from acting rashly. It is very difficult to construct a statutory framework to make that work. If you look at the War Powers Resolution, again, it came up in 1973. It was, in essence, a reaction against the Vietnam War, which, in my view, Congress actually did authorize with the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution. We can argue that back and forth. But Congress tried to create this framework. The process of compromise required on Capitol Hill to get a bill led to this construction of 60 days, and the president can extend it to 90 days if he so desires. But effectively, that was what was needed to pass the legislation, again, over Nixon's veto. But even critics at the time pointed out this was a pre-delegated blank check to the president. He could get the United States into a war, and then Congress would be placing itself in the politically difficult position of then trying to end it. and that would be very difficult to do because you would then confront a president who could veto legislation and what have you. So I'm not sure there's a solution here. And I'll note right now there's a move on Capitol Hill to pass legislation that would prevent President Trump from initiating a preemptive military strike against North Korea. And whatever the merits of that or the probability that the president might engage in such an action, it becomes hung up on a variety of issues like what exactly is preemption? How do you write a piece of legislation so that you don't hamstring the president in the event that North Korea acts in a way in which it's best for the United States to go use military force right away? And so I think there are a lot of practical difficulties in terms of crafting legislation to achieve objectives that people may generally share.
No, that's exactly right, Jim, with respect to really a terrorism AUMF or even, say, a North Korea AUMF. And members of Congress, really on both sides of the aisle, but particularly those who are worried about any president's expansive use of force, don't want to pass any sort of a broad authorization that the president is going to run with, whereas supporters of the president, and they can be Democratic supporters if it's a Democratic president, but certainly Republican supporters of a Republican president don't want to hamstring the president with restrictions. So on, say, a North Korea resolution, in theory, if our Congress were working perfectly, a logical resolution would actually be a authorization to use military force against North Korea in response to or to prevent a North Korean attack, but with a whole lot of limitations, so that you would actually have Congress on record as backing the president, saying, we're with you. If the North Koreans keep threatening us, you're authorized to use force. And so it's not just the Congress serving as a brake, but actually providing authority, saying we're with you.
But that's what happened. That's what happened in 2002.
Exactly.
And a lot of people came to regret it because they thought that President Bush had a deal on the table he should have taken, and he didn't. And we got a war, and we got stuck there. Now, I think some people decided he should have taken the deal after they found out we got stuck there, not necessarily before we got stuck there. But I mean, I think that this is the challenge of trying to write legislation.
And that's why now, even though in theory a good government, I know it sounds broad to say that Congress ought to pass an authorization to use force against North Korea, but I mean, actually, most of us do agree the North Koreans are acting dangerously. But almost no member of Congress is actually going to want to give, particularly this president, authorization to use force in North Korea. They only would want to put a brake on what he was doing. So again, if the war powers and the shared responsibilities between the executive and Congress were working well, we actually would have a very limited resolution to use force with a lot of restrictions to say, but you can't preemptively use nuclear force. But so that's just not going to happen, though.
So looking at this from the perspective of the executive branch, so we're talking about what's incumbent on Congress to do or what it should do. Is there any reason why the executive branch at this point, wrapping up 2017 and the first year of the Trump administration and a world that he has called many times a mess that he inherited, any reason for the executive branch to be behind any sort of clarification or new round of AUMF? They want to keep status quo. Is that fine with them? Or yourself having been inside an executive branch in a time of crisis, any reason why they should try to push for something that maybe clarifies things?
So three successive presidents and their lawyers have been perfectly comfortable with the 2001 AUMF, simply interpreting it very broadly and ever more broadly, and not wanting to seek a new authorization, even in that, though that might be sort of good government, largely because the original 2001 authorization is so broad and they can interpret it even more broadly that working with Congress is likely just to result in a restriction. So, why bother to do that? The one concern that both the Obama administration's lawyers and now the Trump administration lawyers have, but it's really not said publicly very much, is that as these new groups come along that are so far afield from Al-Qaeda that there could be legal challenges which would really have to do with detention.
Yeah, that would be an action-forcing event for Congress.
Right.
If you were to have a district court or something rule and say, throw charges out because it's not permissible under the legislation.
Right. And then the executive branch, though, would rapidly fall back and say, well, even if the 2001 authorization doesn't cover ISIS, the president still has broad constitutional power.
So what you're telling me is presidential lawyers like yourself are very good at their jobs and know the law well and always have a fallback position.
The executive branch lawyers take a broad view of the president's war powers.
Well, you have a client, the President of the United States.
We do. And then on North Korea, I think the White House really does not want to seek. The White House really does not want to seek some sort of an authorization, in part because they knew that anything that were to emerge from Congress would likely have restrictions on it. I think the one thing that surprised me a bit, but it may be that it just hasn't happened yet, is that the Congress has not had some hearings on the possible use of military force against North Korea when the president has threatened to rain fire and fury down on the North Koreans, and we know the North Koreans have nuclear weapons and could attack the South Koreans. You would think Congress would be a bit nervous about that.
But that's also a double-edged sword, I would imagine. If you're Bob Corker or Ed Royce, Senate Foreign Relations Committee, House Foreign Affairs Committee, in doing this, because if you have these hearings, on the one hand, it might be seen as being provocative. The United States is seriously considering military force, and how will that complicate what the president is trying to do? Do you risk being too belligerent, forward-leaning, and precipitating events you want to avoid? On the other hand, it could be that you're worried that holding hearings will alarm people, making them think that military action is very likely, and that will undercut what the president is trying to do with what appears to be coercive diplomacy. So I could see the argument going back and forth about maybe hearings wouldn't serve our interests, or it's not clear how it might play out.
You're right, Jim. It's very delicate. And in the hearing last week, at which Secretaries Mattis and Tillerson appeared, which was mostly about the need for a new authorization to use military force against terrorists, not surprisingly, several members of Congress asked questions about North Korea. And I think the sorts of things that could potentially come out in a hearing that might be useful, but you're right, it's delicate. And I'm not sure with 16, 17 members of the committee if they would all handle it delicately, would be just to get out on the record and to get particularly Secretary Mattis, but also Secretary Tillerson out on the record just what the consequences would be of a conflict with North Korea and its implications for South Korea and elsewhere. This is much talked about in the papers, but, in a hearing, would it be useful to do that? Now, of course, that then is useful maybe for the American people and even for the White House to see that, but maybe it sends the wrong message to the North Koreans.
It may also send the wrong message to South Koreans. Having just come back from Seoul, I think there's a lot of apprehension that a decision to go to war could be made and they will have no role in it. And so I would imagine a lot of South Koreans are looking at what's happening in Washington, trying to figure out, are we actually on a march toward war? And so we'd have to sort of factor that in. I think also similarly with Japan, because Japan could be implicated and affected by this, given the nature of North Korean military, its ballistic missiles and what have you.
I'm told, and Jim, you may have more of a sense of this, that what's actually happening is that Congress is having extensive discussions, some of which is behind closed doors in Congress, and some of it's just informally with the military. But you would hope, again, the significance and consequences of any kind of conflict with North Korea are so extreme that we would hope our elected representatives are having some discussions with both the White House and Secretary Mattis about at least what that would look like, what would be the trigger for a use of military force, how much military force, what would then the consequences be. One would hope that Congress is not just sitting and watching this go by.
I think there's actually a lot that is happening, that taking place outside of hearing rooms. You mentioned informal consultations, executive session, hallway conversation, but also and committees in Congress or members have been requesting information. There was recently a story in the Washington Post laying out what everybody knew or knows, which is if you do have a military confrontation on the Korean Peninsula, you're talking large numbers of deaths in a very short period of time. That appeared on the front pages of the Post, and I believe it was taken from a Pentagon response to a request from Capitol Hill for information. So, again, part of the challenge here is that, Congress generally can only act by doing something formal, creating legislation. And doing so becomes law, and you're a lawyer, and law, we live by the rule of law. Law is constraining or empowering, depending on how the laws are written. But you have always had the potential for perverse consequences, both internally and externally. And I think that's the challenge of this. How do you effectively conduct foreign policy in a political system where you have a constitution that has created separated institutions sharing powers? And quote the famous phrase by the constitutional scholar Edwin Corwin, creates an invitation to struggle between the President and Congress for the privilege of controlling and directing American foreign policy.
You remember your political science and your Constitution.
I was a good student.
So, John, this is a good segue into asking a little bit about the struggles of a legal expert in the national security field. What is it like being in this field where, the stakes couldn't be more important, and yet you're balancing a whole set of issues, including the prerogative of an executive branch to protect the country. Can you talk a little bit about how that plays out, how people in your field are able to work through these things?
Sure. So I served all 8 years in the Bush administration in national security law capacities, 4 years as legal advisor at the National Security Council at the White House, and then 4 more years as legal advisor at the State Department. And certainly for the last 16 years, through 3 administrations, it's been a heavy load for the national security lawyers. It's just been a lot of work, a lot of disagreement in different administrations, and a lot of pressure on the lawyers as policy officials ask them, can we do something, can we not do something? So,
and you're looking at domestic law and international law.
And international law. So, for example, on that point, Bob, with any use of force, executive branch lawyers look both at does the president have authority under domestic law, which is their authority under the Constitution, and is there an authorization to use military force by Congress? But then also under international law, is a use of force permitted under the UN Charter? Is it authorized by the Security Council? Has the country consented, or is it an action in self-defense? So those issues get quite complex when it comes to preemptive uses of force against terrorists who have not yet begun an action.
And that's become quite common in the last 6 or 7 years with the use of drone strikes and so forth.
But then also humanitarian intervention. And there was an enormous amount of pressure during the Obama administration, which the president spent a lot of time on his own, as to what would be the legal basis for the use of force to protect people in Syria in the absence of a Security Council resolution. So a lot of pressure on the lawyers there to come up with a rationale. So legal complexities, both to use force against and to detain and to question terrorists, also with respect to humanitarian intervention. And then we have the bureaucratic process, which sometimes works well and sometimes doesn't, as is well known, and at least in the first term of the Bush administration, a lot of bickering lawyers, disagreeing lawyers being cut out of certain processes, and some sort of resulting in some bad processes and bad decisions. In the Obama administration, I think a greater effort to make have consensus amongst lawyers. But even then, it didn't work out. So, for example, with respect to the decision to use to conclude that the use of force in Libya were not hostilities, the president actually made that decision over the objection of his own Office of Legal Counsel at the Justice Department. So there were disagreements even inside the Obama administration.
And I believe the attack on the Yemeni based terrorist Alaki, who's an American citizen, I believe, raised all sorts of issues as well.
Raised some very serious issues. So, the legal advisors at the National Security Council, in the Office of Legal Counsel, at the State Department, at the Defense Department, at the CIA, the legal advisor, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs, have for the last 16 years spent enormous amounts of time working together to advise their principals and the president with respect to these different decisions.
What you seem to describe is a process that involves a lot of lawyers across a lot of agencies. Is that something new?
I have not done enough historical research, Jim, to know how these issues were handled way back. I mean, presumably in the Vietnam War, we also had lawyers at the State Department and the Defense Department. How well they were working with each other, I don't know. What we saw in the Obama administration, and they took pride in this, and Charlie Savage of the New York Times wrote an entire book about it called Power Wars, was the Obama lawyers had noticed the disagreements amongst the Bush lawyers that resulted in some bad processes. And so they tried to have more consensus-based legal decision-making, where rather than having the general counsel of each department just advising his or her principal, they would really consult with each other and try to reach a consensus view that would then be told that the lawyers group has reached a decision on something. That does make some sense. Then the lawyers all think about something and try to come up with a view. Some cabinet secretaries don't like that.
I can imagine,
because they say, "Well, I've got my lawyer. I don't want to be beholden to a mushy group of lawyers who have come up with a consensus view. I want to have my general counsel tell me what he or she thinks."
And that's why government doesn't operate as efficiently and smoothly as you might think. Lots of strong-willed people who head up institutions and want to push their views to shape policy. That's why they're there.
What I will say is, as with most other appointments in the Trump administration, they've been very slow to make appointments, including amongst the lawyers. So we have virtually none of the national security lawyers that require Senate confirmation have been either nominated or confirmed. So we do not have a confirmed head of the Office of Legal Counsel. We do not have a confirmed legal advisor at the State Department. We do have a confirmed CIA general counsel. We don't even have a nominee right now to have the all-important position of general counsel of the Defense Department. So here we are in the middle of November, and most of these departments' legal offices are being run by career people. The names that have been nominated or confirmed, in one case at CIA, are really some pretty good people. They're people with experience in the Bush administration, pretty centrist lawyers without extreme views who work well together. And I think this is actually a good sign because as these lawyers come in, I think that they will help to bring a good legal sense to the administration as soon as we can get them in. I have not seen names of lawyers who have either been nominated or talked about to go into these national security law positions that are deeply concerning. So if we can get these people nominated, confirmed, and in, I think we will, I hope, have some good national security lawyering. Of course, at the end of the day, we have to see whether the principals and ultimately the president listen to their lawyers. But at least we have got some good people who I hope will be going in.
And on that note, we'll close up the President's Inbox for this week. John, thanks for joining us.
Nice to be with you both.
Please subscribe to the President's Inbox on iTunes and leave us a review. It really helps. Opinions expressed in the President's Inbox are solely those of the host or our guests, not of CFR, which takes no institutional positions. Today's episode was produced by Kevin Lizarazo, with senior producer Jeremy Sherlick, recording engineer Dan Mudd, and with special thanks to Audrey Bowler, Gabrielle Sierra, Corey Cooper, and Ben Shaver. This is Jim Lindsay.
And this is Bob McMahon. Thanks for listening. We'll see you next week on The President's Inbox.